Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à FEDCO pour le 1er juin 2021. Welcome to FEDCO for the meeting of June 1st, 2021. I think everyone knows the procedure rules. Please stay on mute at all times and center your camera and use the raised hand option if you'd like to speak. Before we proceed, I'll do a quick roll call of members. Conseiller Cloutier.
Présent.
Councillor Downs.
Here.
Councillor El Shantiri.
Present.
Councillor Gower.
Here.
Councillor Harder. Councillor Hubley.
Here.
Councillor Luloff.
Je suis présent.
Councillor Moffat. Councillor Suggs.
Here.
Councillor Tierney.
Present.
Vice Chair Dudas.
Good morning.
And we'll go through the consent agenda at this point. And Councillor Harder just arrived. Welcome, Councillor. Declaration of interest, déclaration de conflit d'intérêt. Confirmation of minutes, adoption de procès-verbaux pour le 4 mai 2021. Carried. Community and social services, services sociaux et communautaires, gender and race equity, inclusion, indigenous relations, and social development. Presentation on the anti-racism secretariat. We'll come back to that. We have a motion. Financing lease arrangements for 2020. Carried.
Carried.
Fonds d'investissement et de dotation et sur autres activités de la Trésor 2020. Carried.
Carried.
Capital budget adjustment and closing of project, city tax and rate supported.
Sure, I have one quick question.
Okay, if it's quick, go ahead. Otherwise, we'll come back to it.
I suggest we probably need to come back to it.
Okay. Operating and capital budget Q1 status report. Carried.
Okay.
Revenue service de recette, residential vacant unit tax. We have presentation and members of the public would like to speak to that. Innovative client services, supply services, corporate energy report, rapport municipal sur l'énergie 2020, received.
Received.
Planning, infrastructure, and economic development services, right-of-way, heritage, and urban design services. Heritage Community Improvement Plan application for 35 to 37 William Street, a property designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act and located within the Byward Market Heritage Conservation District. We have one delegate, the owner of the property, Mr. Santaguida. Does anyone have any questions? And then I'll ask Mr. Santaguida if he'd like to speak to it. If there's consensus, then he doesn't have to wait till we get to his item. Does anyone on committee or council have a question on the plan? And Mr. Santaguida, there seems to be broad-based support for this application. You can still speak, but we'd have to get other items done before you. Otherwise, we can pass it now. It's your choice. Mr. Santaguida, if we can let him in. Mr. Santaguida, are you, would you like to speak to it? We'll hold it and come back, or else it will pass, as I indicated. Don't know if you're on mute.
I've just been unmuted, Mayor Watson. I don't need to speak.
Okay, so on the report, Carrie,
Carried.
you and good luck with your project, Mr. Santaguida.
Thank you very much, Mayor and councillors.
Yep.
Mr. Mayor, just on procedure for that report, could I?
We just passed it, but what's the procedural issue?
Well, it's just because we had asked for the clerks or the reports to not just have the ink numbers. And I'm happy that Don did come to committee, but is it possible to amend as we head into council to make sure that the name of the property owner is reflected in the report or their company?
We just add that because I indicated that at the beginning of the presentation, that he was the owner. We'll just put that in the minutes.
Okay, is that possible to amend the report, Mr. Mayor? Like, because over time it's challenging to just see numbers on these
Mr.
reports.
Clerk, I think you have a comment on this.
Mr. Mayor, we will definitely be putting that in the minutes and they will be approved by FEDCO later on. So I believe that would be satisfactory.
Thank you.
Next, City of Ottawa Business Improvement Area Governance. A lot of work went into this. I know a number of members of council sat on a working group with BIAs on the report. Carried.
Carried.
Item 10, under Planning Services, Service de Planification, demande de participation au programme de subvention pour la remise en valeur des friches industrielles 2070 rue Scott et 328 Avenue Winona. Carried.
Carried.
Information previously distributed, integrated street furniture program and the acquisition of former railway corridor known as part of the Beachburg subdivision. And we'll go back to our first item that was held with a delegation. So we'll go to the items that have delegations first. Item number 6, residential vacant unit tax impôt sur les logements vacants. We have a presentation by the Deputy Treasurer, Joseph Mahoney. And then we have 5 delegates that would like to speak to this. And then we'll ask questions of staff. So Ms. Stephenson and Mr. Mahoney, please.
Merci, Monsieur le maire et les membres du comité. Je suis ici avec Joseph Mahoney pour mettre à jour le comité sur le rapport sur la taxe sur les logements vacants. I'm here this morning with Joseph Mahoney to offer a short presentation on the residential vacant unit tax report. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît, Carol. You can move to the next slide, Carol. Thank you. So just a little bit of background. A motion was tabled and carried at council on December the 9th, 2020 from Mayor Watson. And this authorized staff to study the feasibility to impose a vacant unit tax in Ottawa and to also provide what some of those estimated revenues may look like. And we've consulted the CMHC study. They produce a study every quarter that speaks to what the housing market looks like and what those vacancy rates are. And our vacancy rate in 2017 and 2018 was approximately 1.6% and 1.8% in 2019. And this is significantly lower than the 3% that CMHC targets for healthy cities. And currently, when we look at our vacancy rate in Ottawa, it is higher. It's at 3.9%. And this is really due to COVID-related factors. And you think about some of the things that have happened over the last year and a half. We have our students who have left the city, they're e-learning, they're not here and they've left their rentals. And we've also seen reduced immigration in the city as well. And what CMHC is predicting is that those vacancy rates are expected to drop to pre-pandemic levels between 2021 and 2023 as we come out of the pandemic. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. So in studying the vacant unit tax, there were 3 guiding principles that staff put down sort of as a framework in terms of the work that was done. And the first, and I think the most important one, was really increasing that rental housing stock that's available in the market. And the second is that we try and be as fair and equitable in terms of the application of this potential tax, and that we're identifying the correct units for taxation. And thirdly, that the program really be the least administrative burden to not only the city and its administration, but also to the residents that we're serving or who would have to deal with this. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. So when we look at the legislation and the powers, the Municipal Act provides municipalities Ontario with a legislative framework to implement a residential vacant unit tax, and it stipulates that that tax is optional and also that it applies only to residential units in the residential tax class. And that's really important because it means that this tax would not apply to vacant units that sit outside the residential tax class. So unit or tax classes such as the multi-residential class, the commercial or industrial classes. It's very specific to that residential tax class. And also the Act prescribes a formula to calculate that tax. And that formula is fairly simplistic, is simply a tax rate multiplied by the assessment of that property. And also legislation stipulates that the province must designate us in terms of the ability to implement this tax and outline some of the requirements that we'd have to set up in a bylaw, including things such as setting the tax rate, the conditions of that vacancy, what the exemptions would look like, any rebates of tax, should we choose to do that, what the city's audit and inspection powers would be, as well as implementing a dispute resolution mechanism. Prochaine diapo, s'il vous plaît. I've spent a considerable amount of time benchmarking other areas who have implemented this tax or studied this tax. And we looked at tax regimes globally to determine what those best practices were. And the reviews included the cities of Vancouver, Melbourne, Oakland, Los Angeles, Paris, and the Republic of Ireland. And currently, the city of Vancouver is the only municipality in Canada that imposes a residential vacant unit tax, which is known as the empty homes tax. And in Ontario, the City of Toronto and Mississauga are currently considering implementing a vacant unit tax. And based on the benchmarking exercise and the extensive review that was done, staff concluded that the Vancouver model is generally considered to be a very successful model. It's been in place since approximately 2017, and it's reduced the number of vacant units in the city, and it can be easily emulated here in Ottawa and Ontario. Thank you, Carol. We did a significant amount of public engagement, and largely it was done through a public survey posted on Engage Ottawa. And we used a number of mediums to be able to publicize the survey that was available. We leveraged our interim tax billing and it created an insert that went out to all of the property owners in the city and encouraged them to provide feedback on what was being proposed. We also leveraged social media and used public service announcements to get the message out. We received approximately 3,540 submissions across all of our engagement activities, and that was online as well as paper formats. So where folks could not fill out a survey online, we offered to do that for them over the phone, or they could submit a paper format. And 77% of the respondents supported the idea of a residential VUT. We also carried out consultations with key stakeholders in the community, and these included the Greater Ottawa Home Builders Association, the Ottawa Real Estate Board, and the Ottawa Small Landlord Association. And staff also received submissions from other stakeholders in the community. And you'll see the details of the consolidated feedback in the report called What We Heard Report. It was appended to the council report that you have in front of you today. I'm now going to pass it over to Joseph, who's going to walk you through the proposed framework of the tax. Thank you, merci.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So we'll now get into the framework. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this report summarizes the findings of our study and a proposed preliminary framework on how the residential vacant unit tax will work in Ottawa. So should committee and council choose to pursue a residential vacant unit tax in Ottawa, staff will further undertake a study and consultation to develop a complete framework with detailed policies and supporting bylaws. The first vacancy declaration would be due in early 2023 for the previous calendar year of 2022. Any properties that are declared or deemed vacant for the year 2022 would be billed in 2023. The tax will be applied retrospectively to reduce overall administration. Next slide, please. Okay. The Municipal Act prescribes that only residential properties with up to 6 units would be subject to the tax if deemed vacant. These properties, we will refer to them as eligible properties. So properties with 7 or more units assessed in the multi-residential tax class or the new multi-residential class are not subject to the tax, as Wendy mentioned earlier. Similarly, properties in the commercial and industrial property tax classes are not subject to the tax. So staff have developed the following definitions on the conditions of vacancy that determine when the tax would apply. So there's a few definitions I'm going to read through here that really sort of form the framework on when the vacant unit tax would apply. So a residential unit will be considered vacant if it has been unoccupied for an aggregate of 184 days, which is about 6 months plus 1 day during the previous calendar year. And for the purposes of the vacant unit definition, we are defining an unoccupied unit as a residential property that is not a principal residence of the property owner, or residential property that is not occupied for residential purposes by an arm's length tenant under the tenancy agreement or sublease agreement for a term of at least 30 consecutive days. So this excludes anything in the short-term rental side of things. Lastly, I think another key definition that's important to complete the definition, the vacant unit definition, is the definition of the principal residence. So principal residence will be defined as a residential unit that is owned or rented by a natural person, alone or with others, where the natural person is ordinarily a resident and makes their home and conducts their daily affairs, including, without limitation, paying their bills, receiving documentation related to identification, taxation, insurance purposes, driver's license, income tax returns, medical plan documentation, vehicle registration, voter registration, or similar information, and where the natural person has no other property designated as such within the City of Ottawa or any other jurisdiction. So really, a property owner can only have one principal residence. So this definition is consistent with the principal residence definition that was discussed about a month ago in the short-term rental regime, which allows for consistent municipal definition of what constitutes a principal residence. Principal residences are therefore exempt from the definition of a vacant unit for the purposes of this tax. This therefore eliminates the needs for multiple vacancy exemptions related to lifestyle or work that we heard from residents as we went through the consultation process. Next slide, please. Okay, the city can obtain vacancy information annually in one of 3 ways. We can do this through a mandatory declaration, a vacant unit declaration, or a complaints-based approach. Under the mandatory declaration approach, an eligible homeowner, all eligible homeowners in Ottawa would be required to declare to the city if their home is occupied or vacant each year. Under the vacant unit declaration approach, only those who own a vacant unit will be required to declare. Under the complaints-based approach, the city would only be able to identify vacant properties through a complaints-based approach. The mandatory declaration approach received the high support on the survey and is seen to be the most effective in reducing vacancy rates. Benchmarking also confirmed this is the best approach. Staff are proposing this approach to be used here in Ottawa for the purpose of identifying vacant units for the purpose of the vacant unit tax. Under the mandatory declaration approach, eligible property owners would be notified annually in February and asked to report their property's prior year vacancy status by mid-March. The annual vacancy reporting would be completed by residents online, with accommodations available for those who cannot complete the response online. Residents that do not report by the set due date would be subject to a fine and provided with an extended due date. If a property owner fails to report their vacancy status by the extended due date, the property will then be deemed vacant and the vacant unit tax will apply. The vacancy tax, where applicable, will be included in the final property tax bill that is mailed out in May and will have a due date that is in June, together with the remainder of the property taxes. The proposed administration and billing of the tax allows city staff to leverage existing tools to minimize the administrative burden. Next slide, please. And I will talk about some of the exemptions that we're proposing. So staff are proposing the following exemptions to manage unintended consequences where a property is declared or deemed vacant. So we're proposing that an exemption would apply in the following circumstances. One, where a property was transferred under a non-arm's length sale in the previous calendar year, and proof is provided for the land transfer tax or an exemption for first-time home buyers in that case. The second, where a federal or provincial court order prohibiting occupancy, sale, or rental of a property is in effect. Third, where the death of a registered property owner occurred during the tax year. Fourth, where the registered property owner was in hospital or a long-term care facility during the tax year. And fifth, where the property was undergoing extended renovations or construction and all the appropriate building permits were issued. So these are the initial exemptions that we're recommending under the preliminary framework. There were a couple of other ideas and suggestions that were provided by stakeholders and residents that we are considering and will continue to consult on should council approve this basic framework today. Next slide, please. Okay. In order to be successful, the program must have a strong audit function to audit annual declarations and claimed exemptions. Audits will happen year-round and will only go back retroactively for a maximum of 2 years. Where a false declaration is found, the property will be deemed vacant and the tax will apply. So audits will be based on a number of things. One, properties that are declared occupied that were vacant the year before, complaint or tip-based audits, non-arm's length property sales, random selection audits, targeted audit campaigns, just to name a few. La ville élaborera un mécanisme de règlement des différends qui permettra aux résidents de contester l'impôt sur le logement vacant. La contestation doit être soumise par écrit avant la date limite établie. La date limite de soumission des contestations sera diffusée au grand public et inscrite sur chaque facture. Une preuve sera exigée et le personnel effectuera les inspections requises avant qu'une décision soit rendue. Diapositive suivant, s'il vous plaît. Merci. So now we'll talk about the tax rate that is being proposed by staff. In determining the range of potential tax rates, staff considered best practices. We also considered the existing and proposed vacant unit tax rates in other municipalities. And we also considered the regular municipal tax rate here in Ottawa and within other municipalities. We also considered how these regular tax rates relate in proportion to the existing vacant unit tax rates. Rates ranging from 0.5% to 2% were considered and socialized with the public. The survey results favored a tax rate of 2%, followed by a tax rate of 1%, and then 1.5% in that order. Staff are recommending a tax rate of 1%, which would yield a vacant unit tax of $4,150 on the average vacant home in Ottawa. Next slide, please. So we'll go over some of the estimated revenues and costs now. Since vacant unit data is not consistently tracked by the city or any other agency, Staff will not know how many vacant properties there are until the first vacant unit declaration is complete. At this time, staff estimate that there may be between 750 to 3,000 properties in Ottawa that would be subject to the vacant unit tax. Assuming a 1% tax rate and 1,500 properties in the first year, and a reduction in vacant units over time, staff estimate $36 million in revenue over the first 6 years. To run this program, staff estimate that $3.5 million will be required over the first 2 years, and then $1.3 million annually thereafter, adjusted for inflation. After program costs, the tax is estimated to yield or net the city an estimated $25.9 million over the first 6 years. And with that, I'll now pass it back over to Wendy. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Joseph. And you can move to the next slide, Carol. Thank you. So really just in terms of next steps, should committee and council approve the framework, staff are going to establish a team to develop this program, the required bylaws and the supporting policies to implement it. And also important is that staff will continue to consult with stakeholders throughout the development of the program as the final recommendations are prepared and the report with respect to implementation is tabled. And we expect that to happen around the spring of 2022. Merci, Monsieur le maire. C'est la fin de cette présentation.
Bon, alors merci beaucoup. Thank you very much. It's a great presentation. And also just wanted to confirm, Wendy, that the funding that we generate from this program will in fact be put into affordable housing projects. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct, Mr. Mayor. We had identified this as a potential funding source in the long-range financial plan for housing.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 6 guest speakers who would like to speak to this. So if members could hold their questions to staff, we'll start with Cheryl Parrott, Hintonburg Community Association. Good morning, Cheryl. Nice to see you virtually. And you have 5 minutes.
Good morning, everyone, and Mayor and council members. So the Hintonburg Community Association is absolutely thrilled with this report, the recommendations and the speed with which this has moved along. So please keep the momentum going and pass this quickly so that you can have it implemented for 2022. Some members will remember we presented in November at the CPS budget debate with a request for a vacant unit tax like this. And at that time, there were 8 vacant buildings within 1 block of the newly opened Tom Brown Arena Respite Center. There were also a number of homeless encampments along the Trillium line, all within 2 blocks of these 8 vacant buildings. And the contrast of homeless people getting daytime warmth inside Tom Brown when steps away were vacant buildings that had been perfectly good, affordable housing had a really big impact on us. 6 of these buildings were in good shape. They were not crappy places. They were places where many people lived, and at least 2 of these were rooming houses. These neighbors were evicted for grand redevelopment schemes, which have still not happened. They have sat empty from 1 to 8 years, and 6 of these buildings are still boarded, full of weeds, garbage left around or dumped. 4 of these buildings were broken into by people seeking shelter. And there's many more than those 8 buildings within Hintonburg alone that have been vacant for years. And it was quite shocking to see the estimate in the staff report of 750 to 3,000 empty units. It's much bigger than we thought. The one staff person that's tasked with following up on these vacant properties of the 200 that are on your list can't keep up. And at least 6 to 8 years ago, Richcraft assembled land at Parkdale and Scott. Tenants were evicted from several of the properties. At least one of those units was a rooming house. The building assessment report said the building was perfectly good. It had sloped floors, which I have sloped floors, so it was a good building. Subsequently, the buildings were broken into, continually covered in graffiti, dumping, weeds. So a demolition application was applied for by Richcraft. They were granted the application. The area was to be fenced and sodded to prevent it from becoming a parking lot. It's now a parking lot. So again, enforcement will be required. And there has to be a better way, and we think this is the way. So this tax would help ensure that property owners remain motivated to keep rental units or return vacant units into the market supply. It would help to ensure eviction does not happen until redevelopment is approved and construction is ready to start. And we certainly support the denial of an exemption for orders that declare a unit uninhabitable due to the owner's inaction. Demolition by neglect is not an uncommon problem in the city or in Hintonburg. So we urge you to accept the staff recommendation and to quickly implement this so it can be assessed on properties for the 2022 tax year. And also to consider directing staff to assess whether using information from the Water Department and/or Hydro Ottawa could be useful in assessing vacancy for audit purposes. Many of the properties that we've reported for addition to the vacant property list had their hydro disconnected several years ago, and one would assume that the water was also disconnected if there's no hydro. So thanks to staff for the report, and I
Thank you, folks there. Cheryl, you're okay there? Great.
Yeah, I'm done.
Members of committee, questions? Councillor El-Shantiri, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Cheryl, for your presentation. I'm not sure if Cheryl going to be able to answer this question, but in your catchment area or right across the city, do we know exactly how many vacant units out there? Because the number, it seems scarce. Maybe that question could be for staff. They can answer it later on. But Cheryl, do you know how many units in your area?
No, I haven't done a count because it changes a bit. But we had heard at one point before November, we had heard there were 50 in our area. It's only by walking around sometimes we found some buildings that have been vacant for 3 and 4 years that neighbors tell us, and it's only by looking for the hydro disconnect that we've been able to assess it. Then we've sent it in to be added to the list. So clearly, and I think staff have said this, the list is not complete. It's only on a complaint basis.
Okay, I'll keep that question for the staff after, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Leeper, please.
Thank you, Mayor. Cheryl, thank you very much, and thanks to the HCA for its action on this. I will just say I received your email with respect to Richcraft, and obviously we'll be following that up shortly. Staff have 2 decisions about what to recommend that are important. The first is how are we going to know about vacant units? Is it going to be through a declaration or complaints based? And I don't know if you have any advice for this committee with respect to the direction in which that should go. And staff have also lean toward a 1% tax instead of, say, a 2% tax. And I don't know if you have any advice with respect to what the tax rate should be. But can I ask, do you have any advice for this committee with respect to how are we going to track vacant units, and how are we, to what level should we tax them?
Well, I certainly hope you do look at working with Hydro and the Water Department. In Winnipeg, they were using the Water Department as a means of trying to determine what was vacant and what wasn't. So if your water wasn't used and I understand those are almost daily reports. So to be able to track that should be a good indicator, whether the province allows that or not, but hopefully at least for audit purposes, you could. Hydro Ottawa, there seems to be no connection between the city and Hydro Ottawa. And clearly if they turn off the hydro, the water is off because the pipes would freeze. So those are really, I think, important ways internally of getting that information. And I forget what your second question was.
The tax rate. There's staff are leaning towards 1%, but we've also seen, proposals for 2%. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Certainly I would prefer to see it a bit higher. I had thought Vancouver was talking about going to 4%, but perhaps that is wrong. But I know they did raise it to the 1.25%. And I think, you know, what we've seen in the past is over the past 30 years in Hindenburg is the only time people pay attention is when there is a financial incentive to comply.
Yep.
So I would prefer to see it higher than the 1%, but 1% is better than nothing.
Okay.
Anything else, Councillor?
No, thank you very much, Mayor. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Cheryl, for your input. Appreciate it. Our next presenter is Ann Hanna. Ms. Hanna, I believe you have a video as well, so the floor is yours for the next 5 minutes.
Okay, I'd submitted the video and I'm just waiting for Carol to play.
Do you want to say anything before we show the video?
I would just like to say I appreciate Cheryl's presentation, and as a longtime resident of Hindenburg, this is an issue that we've dealt with over the years, and it has been it's almost like a part-time job managing different abandoned units in the neighborhood and looking at them with safety concerns. And I would just like to see, as our city is in a housing crisis, I would just like to see it be more, I would like to see it not be a great way to save money to displace some of the most vulnerable residents in our community and board up the buildings, as that would be less expensive while you wait for your development project to go ahead.
Okay, so you'd like to roll the video now? Here we go.
Oh. My name is Ann Hanna. I have been a resident of Hindenburg for 17 years, and I am the mother of 4 kids that have grown up here and attend school in this neighborhood. When we first moved here, there was definitely crime and not a lot of businesses were here, and it was considered a somewhat dangerous neighborhood. In the 17 years, we've seen that change with house prices rising dramatically. And while there were lots of low-income rental units in this neighborhood, that has changed. The house next door to us that had been divided into 3 rental units and was fully occupied was sold. The occupants who had lived there for quite a long time were told they had to leave. The new owners would be occupying the building. That didn't happen, and instead the building sat vacant for over 2 years. And that's not an isolated incident. I can think of 5 other rental units that were purchased and the tenants evicted, and then the buildings boarded up and left to sit empty for years at a time. For these developers, it's pure profit, and it's profit that does not stay in the community. This vacancy tax is an attempt to recoup some of the cost borne by us. I believe the vacancy tax would discourage developers and land value speculators from needlessly and illegally evicting the tenants of the buildings that they buy. Seeing our most vulnerable community members displaced so someone can speculate on land value is devastating. And that's all I have to present. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Let's see if anyone has any questions from committee. Councillor Leeper. You're on mute.
No, thanks, Chair. Just to say thank you very much, Anne. I think you've gotten exactly at the heart of the issue. There are a lot of other things that need to be done besides this vacant tax, though, and I think you've spoken particularly to the, I think, shameful evictions that are being allowed by the landlord-tenant board, in which those evictions are being authorized on spurious grounds that everybody in the neighborhood knows are not valid. So I appreciate your touching on that. Thank you, Mayor.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hanna. Next is Salma Al-Shihabi, followed by Tony Miller.
Good morning, Mayor.
Good morning. The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So I'm here to present a different perspective from what my co-residents have shared with you today. First of all, I would like to give you what I my suggestions, and then I'll give you my concerns in full. First of all, I have gone through the reports and what we heard at report, and I ask you not to adopt the proposed VUT as it is right now. First of all, I'd like you, well, this is my first recommendation for you. In the report, it says only between 760 units and up to 3,000 units that are expected to be tax eligible. So I'm just wondering, out of the 22,000 units that we have vacant in Ottawa, according to the report, what are the 19,000+ units that are not taxable? Where do they sit? Given that we have a housing crisis, I think we need to really consider important questions such as how this tax will impact the housing market before we adopt this policy. So, for example, how is it going to impact housing supply? How is it going to impact housing affordability, the vacancy rates? And if we're going to be looking into all of this combined, how much will it cost the city to provide monthly housing allowances to people who no longer can afford the city, for example, as a consequence of implementing this tax? And then I have concerns about, could this tax become barrier to creating more housing supply, given the fact that we have 50% of the market in Canada, which the rental market I'm talking about, is in the hands of owners of 2 to 3 doors. And then I also have concerns about this tool becoming a systemic racism tool, and I will elaborate on this as well. I also would like to ask you to, could staff have an alternative administrative method than what is proposed in this report? And if I have gone door to door to multiple residents in multiple wards, and none of the owners I've talked to had actually seen the VUT survey that staff has mentioned it was in the water bill. So we really need to create better communication with our residents. And I'm wondering if you can also have some directions to staff with regards to that, considering how how the proposal is in this report about letting people know about this. So my issues with the proposal as it's shared in the staff report is the number of units that are going to be brought back with this tax are a mere 250 to 1,000 units in 6 years. If you do the math, how the staff have come to that according to table 16. So the number of units that's going to be going back to the market is not that huge, but also the burden that you're adding to homeowners about reporting yearly and deeming the unit vacant if the property owner does not fill up the survey. I think these are additional burdens to homeowners. The other thing is 58% of respondents did not want the city to consider the unit vacant if it's left for 6 months unoccupied. However, staff are recommending this because 42% wanted that and because Vancouver has done that. So we really need to consider what the majority of our residents want, and this is not something they wanted to do. Additionally, if we look into that, what we heard at report, of the 3,500 people surveyed, 25% are actually renters who are not going to be reporting on this. So how, if we keep that in mind, the majority of homeowners did not want a mandatory yearly reporting requirement. And I would be curious to know how many homeowners, if we only consider the homeowners who are going to take this burden, would actually want this reporting requirement yearly. So as a VUT presented, I find it's going to be invasive of homeowners and tenants' freedom and privacy. I have been a tenant. I am not.
We'll have to. Sorry, you're over your time. So thank you. Does anyone have a question for the delegation? Councillor El-Shantiri, please.
I was interested, Salma, when you mentioned this is going to be basically systemic racism. Like, where did you have that? Like, where's the connection here? What am I missing?
Well, the connection is the following. First of all, as a tenant, I am a tenant, okay? And we know that landlords will be looking at their tenants' occupation, their tenants, and they select who they rent to. And when I was a sales representative, for example, many moons ago, I never told my landlord where I'm going, how many times I'm leaving the unit, and if I was going to sales meeting, a sales event. I never reported to that. And I have a retired teacher, similarly, who once he retired, he went to teach overseas in China. So he'd be gone for 10 months. He never told his landlord where he's going. He would lock his unit. He was happy that he could actually do that, where he can leave his belongings in one place, go teach overseas, come back without having to look for an apartment or compete with the rest of people for a unit, or worry where to leave his belongings. I'm afraid if we put this tax, with how we are trying to implement it, would this become a burden to homeowners to prove that their unit is rented, for example? If they get a tip from the neighbor that this unit is vacant, but it's actually rented, could that become an issue for the landlords that they don't want to rent to people who could subject them to such scrutiny?
So sorry, Salma, you're going all over. That's not my question. My question is, you said this will create systemic racism. I ask you, where do you see this so we can learn from it? And yet you didn't answer any of that.
No, I am answering the question. So one of the things is, if we are putting this vacant unit tax, first of all, we are asking every homeowner, regardless if they have another unit or not, to report yearly. This is going to be creating a lot of undue hardship to homeowners who are renting or not renting their units. So if I was a tenant in this, they might be that the landlord may not rent to me, for example, if I might cause them more hassle. If they have to worry about a neighbor reporting their unit not rented or not occupied, this is how I feel it could become a systemic inequality where, I might not be able to rent in a market because, let's say, of my creation. I'm just giving as an example. Okay. And the other thing is.
Shantiri. Sorry, anything else, Councillor Shantiri?
No, thank you.
Other people to speak. So thank you. Tony Miller is our next guest speaker. Mr. Miller, you have 5 minutes, please.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor. Good morning, committee members. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Ottawa Small Landlord Association. OSLA is the voice for small landlords in the Ottawa area. I'm not here to oppose the report, and I would like to remind members that small landlords want and need their units to be occupied. Very few small landlords are speculators. From time to time, OSLA runs surveys to determine the impacts of the landlord and tenant board crisis and poor tenant behavior are having on our membership. The May survey results show that 19% of small landlords have left one or more of their units vacant, and that 10% of small landlords have sold at least one of their rental properties in 2021. These results indicate the continued erosion of long-term and affordable rental housing in Ottawa, which is something the city is concerned about and has worked very hard to prevent. For example, in October 2020, Council passed a motion that asked the province to ban all residential rental evictions. This was done to help protect tenants as well. In November 2020, Council passed a motion for staff to study the tools available to municipalities to prevent or prohibit rent evictions at the city level. This is being done to protect tenants and prevent the erosion of affordable rental housing, even though evictions and the Residential Tenancies Act falls under the jurisdiction of the province. In April 2021, Council approved the short-term rental bylaw, once again to protect communities and tenants, and to prevent, yes, the erosion of long-term rental housing. Today, this committee will likely approve staff's report because of the city's desire to prevent the erosion of rental housing and to generate revenue that will be used towards affordable housing, which is desperately needed. So the city has taken action to protect tenants and the affordable rental housing stock. So it is reasonable to ask the city to protect small landlords by, one, providing a temporary exemption for small landlords who leave their units vacant for more than 6 months until such a time that the Landlord and Tenant Board meets its service delivery standards of 25 days to schedule hearings, instead of the current wait times of 8 to 12 months. Number two, as part of the ongoing rent eviction study, the city researched the the LTB hearing delays and include mechanisms at the municipal level that will help protect small landlords and the severe impacts of the delays, and to prevent the further erosion of Ottawa's affordable housing rental stock. Again, if the city can enter into the provincial realm of the RTA to help tenants, the city can do the same to help small landlords. We participated in stakeholder meetings with city staff. Our request for a temporary exemption for small landlords who are leaving their units vacant because of the LTB crisis and the increase in poor tenant behavior was dismissed. Our request was dismissed apparently because staff told us that the LTB crisis will be fixed before 2023, which is when the proposed bylaw would come into effect, even though there is no evidence to support the claim that the LTB will be fixed.
1 minute.
Oh, I still have 2 minutes, sir. I have it on my, my timer.
My clock has you at 1 minute, so go ahead.
The last thing that small landlords need is to have a city tax imposed on them because of the mismanagement of the LTB by the province. The city must not penalize small landlords who are making the difficult decision to leave their units vacant because of the significant increase in bad tenant behavior or tenant bad behavior and the lack of legal recourse from the LTB. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question for you from Councillor Luloff, please.
Hi, Tony. Can you educate me a little bit here on why a small landlord would leave their unit vacant because of the delays at the landlord tenant board?
Sure. There are a couple of reasons. Number one, as I mentioned, is the increase in poor tenant behavior. So what we have seen since, let's say, prior to COVID, and because of the delays at the landlord tenant board, is that an increase in tenants who are stealing rent. So I'm talking about tenants who can afford to pay rent but are choosing not to. An increase in tenants who are damaging property, tenants who are refusing access to properties, tenants who are refusing to move out, tenants who are demanding large sums of money known as cash for keys before moving out. And also of course, when that happens, landlords will apply to the landlord and tenant board that Councillor Leeper was mentioning and they have to wait a good 8 to 12 months before even getting in front of the board to have a hearing for eviction when those things happen. So why would small landlords take the risk? Small landlords are different from big landlords in that we don't have the financial capacity, the risk tolerance levels that big landlords have. If we have a vacant unit for a few months, that can ruin the whole investment. And it's another, if that happens, as I mentioned, properties will be sold, and that's what we're seeing today. So small landlords don't want to keep their units vacant. They want to have them occupied. They need the rental income. They definitely need them. But they're at the point now, because of the LTB and the increase in poor tenant behavior and the lack of legal recourse, well, they have no choice, Councillor. What are they going to do, right? They have the choice to sell, or they can try to fill them. And yes, there's tenant screening, of course, that's available to them. But we all know that tenant screening, there's no magic pill that will automatically fix. There's no tenant screening tool or process that will guarantee success.
Councillor Luloff, anything else?
Just one quick last question, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for that. So what you're saying is that because there's a delay in landlord tenant board hearings, that you feel that the only recourse that a small landlord has is to be backstopped by the LTB, essentially. And so small landlords are choosing not to rent out their apartments and leaving them vacant because they don't have that backstop. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. They don't. The risk is too high. There's really no legal recourse for small landlords, and as a result, every residential lease in Ontario today has an unofficial 9 to 12 month eviction ban attached to them because there's no support from the province or the LTB.
So what would you do to improve this vacant unit tax today?
From a small landlord's perspective, we have a few recommendations that I didn't include in the report or in my talk, but one would be to set up a working group with small landlords, city councilors, city staff to talk about some of the issues that small landlords have when it comes to rental housing policies and the real estate market. Number two would be the establishment or working with the renovation study team to provide protection to small landlords that is desperately needed because the province isn't providing it right now. So those are a couple of items. And we'd also actually,
thank you, Mr. Miller.
Oh, sorry,
Go
I was
ahead,
just gonna add one thing. You may have heard like in Toronto and Hamilton, they have something called the Tenant Defense Fund. There's the idea also, well, why not set up a support fund for small landlords, small residential landlords who run into financial difficulties because of the landlord-tenant board.
Great, thank you. Councillor Kudas, please, questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Tony, for being here. I had a question about the impacts of the pandemic. You mentioned that you've seen it, and there's some of the landlords have seen an increase in poor tenant behavior. Is this something that has been increased by the pandemic? Is this an experience that you've noticed more so since this has arrived?
Yes, it actually started with the landlord and tenant board delays. And the landlord and tenant board delays go back to 2018 and maybe earlier. I see John Dickey is on the screen, so he'd probably be able to speak better to that than myself. But it's really the LTB and the pandemic has definitely, and including the eviction bans, have definitely added and exacerbated the issue.
So I guess my question is, once again, this has been a completely unusual and unforeseen circumstance for everyone in terms of a pandemic. Is the anticipation that the need for landlords, small landlords, to keep these units empty because they're having difficulties with tenants or they just can't find the right person, will that diminish once the pandemic is over?
No, I don't think so. I think it's the landlord and tenant board is the root cause of the problem, and the pandemic is just piling on top of it.
Okay. So once again, we don't have as municipality control over that board, but you did come up with a couple of suggestions about continuing to work with city staff to have your voice heard, to have small landlords heard.
Yeah.
This report today, staff are going to take back if this is passed and continue to work on the framework for what this looks like. There will be opportunities likely for you to continue to engage in that, whether through written or the working group is used to suggest. Would that be satisfactory in terms of you think your membership's meeting your membership's needs?
We would welcome any opportunity to connect with the city, to have a working group. Definitely, currently today, small landlords really don't have any liaison or conduit into the city on a regular basis. I mean, it's great. My councillor, Luloff, and others have been very helpful, and of course, we get to speak at committee. But having that type of working group or something would be really helpful.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next is Councillor Brockington, please.
Thanks, Mayor. Good morning to you and colleagues. Mr. Miller, thank you for your presentation. Councillor Luloff asked most of my questions. Just a clarification now from me. Given that you stated most of your members don't want to have vacant units, they are small landlords. Many have full-time jobs elsewhere. This isn't their main source of revenue to live. What proportion of the homes when they are vacant are because they are tied up with the tribunal and they just don't want to rent to someone else? Or is the tenant actually in the house still while they are waiting to be heard? or has that tenant left and it's remaining vacant and they're choosing to keep it vacant in the short term?
Thanks for the question, Councillor. It depends on the application that's submitted by the landlord. So if the tenant is still there and it's for non-payment of rent, then the application would be submitted to the LTB, and usually the tenant is still occupying the unit. There are cases where the tenants have moved on, and there are applications available to small landlords to apply to get those monies back, or the rent that's owed back.
So you had asked earlier for a waiver for cases where a landlord has not rented it out because I think they're waiting to go to the tribunal. That must be a very small number of cases, though, is it not?
Well, it's not so much that they're waiting to go to the tribunal. It's more that small landlords are, the risk is too high for them to rent it out at all. So they're choosing to leave it vacant. That's it. So it's not necessarily that they have someone in the unit and then, they're going to the tribunal. It's just, that's it. Like they're at wit's end with the lack of legal recourse at the LTV, and the risk is too high because, well, you never know who you're going to get into your unit, and it's very hard to get a terminated tenancy nowadays in today's environment.
Fair enough. Okay, thanks for your advocacy as always, and appreciate your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Miller, the bulk of your issues appear to be in the landlord-tenant board. What are you and your members doing to reach out to government MPPs to bring these issues? Because you're bringing us a lot of your challenges, but we have no jurisdiction, obviously, over the LTV.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. The reason I'm bringing these forward here today is because I know that the city is developing the renoviction study that enters into the provincial realm of the Residential Tenancies Act in terms of meeting at the provincial level. There are some of my colleagues in different landlord groups, small landlord groups, who are part of a working group at the Landlord and Tenant Board to discuss issues and solutions. Many of our members have reported and talked to the Ombudsman, who is investigating the challenges at the Landlord and Tenant Board. And so my role here is really at the city level, and to raise awareness about the impact of the LTB that the LTB is having on the Ottawa real estate market and small landlords.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Please.
Thank you, Mayor. And Tony, my question, I think, is similar to Councillor Brockington's. There's a vacant unit tax is something the city is considering in order to deal with a large number of properties. And, what you're asserting this morning is that we have a problem with vacancies because landlords can't count on the landlord-tenant board to quickly kick people into the street in the middle of a pandemic. And then we also have the problem that has been brought to us by Ms. Parrott and Ms. Hanna this morning of actual buildings that are vacant because landlords are speculating. We can see those on the street. We see them boarded up. We see the impact that's having on the nearby community. We feel the loss of that affordable housing. And I just wonder, can you give me some idea of, which is the bigger problem here? Is it tenants who are trying to screw landlords and can't be kicked into the street quickly enough, or is it property speculation in which property after property after property is sitting vacant with massive problems in the community?
Thanks, Councillor. I would just like to say that we don't oppose the VUT tax. We understand that there's a need for derelict properties and properties that have been sitting vacant for a long time. There has to be some movement on those. So it's not that we oppose those. I would take exception to the comments of tenants being kicked out onto the street. There's no statistics available that show exactly how many tenants who are legally evicted actually end up on the street. It's a very small number, and most people actually find suitable housing when that happens. We're really concerned about the inability to have legal recourse, which is something that small landlords deserve. 49% of small landlords, according to the Real Estate Investment Network, CMHC, and the Aliferis Group, provide 49% of the rental housing stock. And we're providing housing. They're investments. These are small landlords who are looking for, who are investing for their futures. They're both, couples are working. They have families. Could be your neighbor. Could be your friends, and they deserve to have legal recourse. Why shouldn't they? There's no reason why anybody should be able to enter into a rental unit and not pay rent, damage property without consequences.
Anything else, Councillor Leeper?
I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. Next is John Dickey, Eastern Ontario Landlord Organization. Good morning, Mr. Dickey. You have 5 minutes.
Good morning, Mr. Watson. Thank you very much. The Eastern Ontario Landlord Organization submitted a written submission, but I will not be following the order of that submission. I may refer to it a couple of times. You know us and have known us for 30 years. And we do represent, most of our membership do operate properties in the multi-residential sector. And I understand full well that they are not directly affected by what is being proposed today. However, some of our members do own property in the residential class. They may have 40 units, but they're all in triplexes or sixplexes. And I am also in touch with many landlords who do own and operate in the residential class, both through the small landlord organizations in the city and through the practice that my law firm has, which represents landlords both large and small. And I would like to suggest to you that EOLO has always sought to speak for the whole rental housing sector, not merely large landlords. We have had good conversations with Mr. Mahoney on this issue, two, in fact, very helpful conversations, and I thank him for those. In general, EOLO is in support of the report. And in particular, we support the adoption of the 1% tax rate. We feel that that's quite high enough because it will effectively double the tax burden on properties that are subject to the new tax. I have two key areas to address. On page 3 of EOLO's submission, there's a section entitled A Key Additional Exemption. And this is an exemption that the staff allude to, and I've quoted their section. They allude to it at page 12, saying, referring to the public consultation, they say there was support for an exemption for non-principal residences listed for rent or sale for more than 6 months, provided there was documentation that they were in fact listed. They were listed at a competitive market price, and yet they still didn't rent. So that is one thing that I would like to encourage the staff to look at and urge council either to direct them to look at that, or at least not to direct them not to look at that. Because certainly we see and are aware of landlords who have been in that problem. And during the pandemic, it's more frequent, but it can happen at other times as well. So then the key thing I would like to address is the tricky business of how do you discourage people from keeping properties vacant, but at the same time encourage redevelopment so that the housing stock can be improved and indeed increased. And to me, that is easier said than done. I acknowledge that there can be reasons why properties are held vacant for neglect, some people's mental health. In terms of speculation, I have a different perspective than some people in this committee seem to have, because as a speculator, it would be ideal if the property one was speculating in could continue to deliver income. Because of course you have to pay the property taxes, you have to pay various things about the property. So really you want that property occupied. The problem, the reason why people, the legitimate reason, the main reason I would suggest why people sometimes let a property go vacant is the uncertainty of proceeding to the landlord and tenant board. If the intention is to sell for vacant possession, then you don't want to put a tenant in because you may not get them out. If the intention is to demolish, you don't want to put a tenant in because the tenant can hold up your development for several years through the process of appeal, through the current 12-month delay at the board. The tenant is entitled to 3 months compensation. The tenants are entitled to a lot of relief. And I'm not going to go the route that Mr. Miller went of suggesting you address those issues, but I am strongly suggesting that you should consider those issues in trying to achieve this balance to achieve your purpose, because you want properties occupied and you want housing improved, and thus you want redevelopments to be able to go ahead. And I would suggest that this be part of the subsequent consultation that the staff intend to do, and that we need to achieve the best result by not discouraging those who want to redevelop, while at the same time discouraging those who aren't getting it done. So I strongly submit that this needs further discussion. And really that's my main point for today. So I'd be happy to answer questions.
No one has a question, so thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and councillors.
Faith Housing, our friend Suzanne, who's well known to most of us, I believe. Suzanne, welcome. And, I think you had a successful tulip-a-thon.
We did. We did. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone for our support. It was a very successful tulip-a-thon despite being virtual for a second time. So thank you for allowing me to speak this morning. I am the Executive Director of Multi-Faith Housing Initiative. I'm also president of the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association, and I'm a member of the Centralized Housing Registry Board. And I am thrilled with this initiative. So I'll start by saying that I support the initiative and I'd like to see the city adopt the proposed tax. And this is kind of, if we look back at our statistics, there are over 12,000 households on the wait list in Ottawa for affordable housing. That's households, not people. That represents a much greater number of people. In January 2020, the City of Ottawa declared a state of emergency around affordable housing. And this tax initiative is both timely and needed to help support our answer to that state of emergency. In Ottawa, since 2020, the average cost of purchasing a house has increased from between 43 and 51% across the board. A balanced market in real estate terms is considered when there are between 6,000 and 8,000 units on the market. As of this morning, according to realtor.ca, we have only 1,490 units on the market. This shortage results in price competitions and for available units, which have the result of pushing those prices upward. So how does this affect me in affordable housing and the rental housing? The reality is we are all tied together. We live in an ecosystem. Housing is a continuum. And when these prices are very high, is what they do is they prevent people from being able to move from the rental market into the housing market as first-time housing buyers. It keeps it out of the reach and it keeps people in rental, which consequently puts pressure on the rental market, disallowing people to be able to move and creating that space that there's no place for someone to go from affordable into market rental. So I recognize that for certain cases and in certain situations, some developers may feel the need that it's more appropriate to sit on those units, whether they're going through different processes of redevelopment, and it's in their best interest to let those units sit idle. So when housing is so desperately needed, what I think is if it is in their best interest to let those units sit idle, the least they can do is help in other ways. And this tax is other ways. In addition to the housing prices increase, we have seen building pricing increasing. The affordable housing is desperately in need of stock. The recent federal budget has included a lot of money for the development of affordable housing, but because of these increased prices of stock and building and supply, what we know is that the cost of building our units is going to go up substantially in the next couple of years. We're going to need more money in order to do what we had thought we might have done with less a year or two ago. And we need the city to be able to put in its fair share of that amount of money. And this revenue of 26 million over 6 years could go a long way in making a difference in the lives of Ottawa natives who are most in need of that affordable housing. So on that note, I'm going to thank you all for your leadership and for letting me speak today. And I am happy to take your questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. And also belated congratulations on the great opening of Veterans House in the East End. That's something you should be very, very proud of.
Thank you.
I don't see anyone with a question, so we'll bid adieu and thank you for your participation. Okay, so we have before us the two recommendations by staff. Any other questions to staff? I think Councillor El-Shantiri had a question to staff. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And just to follow up on what staff earlier, can you tell us how many across the city, how many vacant units we have across the city?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So at this point, there is no definite way of us measuring the exact number of vacant units across the city. We've relied on a number of various sources that tell us exactly, that tell us how many units could potentially be vacant across the city. And based off of that, we've developed an estimate of what we think the tax could apply to. So in 2016, Stats Canada did a survey that indicated that about 22,000 units in Ottawa, there were about 22,000 units in Ottawa that were vacant or unoccupied for a significant amount of time. Now, those units include a lot of different things. It could be people that may have been away from their units due to lifestyle. It also includes multi-residential units that are not subject to this tax as well. So I think those are factors that we need to factor in as well. When we look at some of the more specific items, I think in our last survey, I think from CMHC, or the last CMHC report, I think indicated closer to about, about 3,000 to 4,000 units that are actually vacant and unrented at this point in time. And then we also have, and those are units that they actually track, which are multi-residential. So between that and other sources of data that we've actually used, we've actually come up with an estimate of what we believe could be the number of units that could be subject to the tax. But until that vacant unit declaration is actually done, we're not really going to know exactly how many units are vacant within the city.
My second question, Joseph, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer this or maybe legal. So obviously you check with other municipalities who have this bylaw in place. And if we go back to Vancouver in 2019, they have a multiple lawsuits. So is there anticipation for court challenge? Have we checked with other municipalities to avoid or to learn from their mistake if there was a mistake in place?
So I'll answer one part of that question, and then if there's any comments from legal, they're welcome to jump in. So we have been in touch and benchmarking quite frequently with the city of Vancouver. It is a Canadian municipality, and I think they're closest to home in terms of the demographics. I think they are most similar to Ottawa. They're quite similar to Ottawa in terms of the layout and the number of units. And I think there's some lessons learned from what they went through, and we're taking those into account. And we do hope that we're not going to face the same legal challenges that they faced. So we are talking to other municipalities. We are gleaning from their lessons learned as we move forward to develop this program.
And do we know, besides Vancouver, who else have similar bylaw? Like, do we have similarity in Ontario other than Vancouver? Like, do we have something close to home?
So we are the first ones, I guess, in Ontario at this point that have presented a framework. The powers have existed, I think, since about 2017, 2018. The City of Toronto had petitioned the provincial government for powers to impose a vacant unit tax, I think in 2017, and they received those powers. And those powers were also added to the Municipal Act. Toronto is currently considering a vacant unit tax as well. They will be tabling their report in July. So they're coming down the same path as we are. And there's a couple of other municipalities in Ontario that are considering this. But I think we are sort of blazing the track with regards to actually presenting a framework to council for consideration in Ontario.
Okay, Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Joseph, you and Wendy, and thanks to all the people who present to us today. They really shed some different light on it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And that's a good question. It's nice to be leading the pack on this issue in the province of Ontario. Councillor Leeper, please.
Thank you. To staff, I guess the question comes back to something I asked Ms. Parrott earlier with respect to what the rate might be. You've given us a table that indicates that, you know, a 2% on average would bring in $8,300 a year from a vacant unit. 1% is obviously half of that at $4,150. The survey leaned towards 1%, but is that the only factor that we're going to consider in setting the rate? My goal with this vacant unit tax would be that it serve as a significant disincentive to leaving properties vacant. And the higher the charge, the greater the disincentive. Why are staff leaning toward a 1%? Is it just because people said in a survey that's what it could be?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. So there's a couple of things, and perhaps Wendy may also want to jump in as well. So the first item, I think, is the survey did actually favor a higher percentage. I think most of the survey respondents favored a 2% increase. City staff also did benchmarking with other municipalities to try and understand what was generally looked at as a good starting point in terms of trying to implement a vacant unit tax, and 1% seems to be a generally accepted good starting point. Vancouver, for example, started at 1%. They increased to 1.25%, and they are now considering increasing up to 3%. So I think starting at 1% gives us room to grow. It also gives us an opportunity to assess the effectiveness of the tax that we've put forward before we make any changes.
Is there a methodology for determining how significant a vacant unit tax could be at different levels of taxation? I don't know if there is any math that we can do on that to demonstrate that there will be X fewer units at Y rate or you know, Z fewer units at X rate.
If I could just start, Councillor, and then I think Joseph can add a little bit here. In terms of the rate that we put in front of you in the report and the recommendation, it is fairly punitive. The taxes are basically equivalent to what someone would pay in terms of their entire property taxation, both the municipal and education portion in a year. So that was part of the consideration. And then based on the work that was done by staff and everything that's emulated at the City of Vancouver, what you see over the years that they've had the tax in place is those number of units have actually dropped off. So it's giving you the result you want in terms of returning those properties to the rental market. So the expectation is that your revenue would actually decrease as you move through the program and those properties go back into the rental market.
And obviously the long-term goal would be to receive no revenue whatsoever because units are not vacant. I am feeling very Old Testament this morning with respect to this issue. And so, you know, I will continue to keep an open mind with respect to the rate, and if 1% is the right rate, okay. But this morning I would prefer that it be higher and thus more punitive. Thank you very much.
What does the Old Testament have to do with?
Oh, sorry. There's Old Testament and there's New Testament, and one is more vengeful. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Gower, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can staff just explain again why the rationale for not including multi-tenant residential? Because I believe Vancouver has a much broader range of residential buildings that do qualify. So why not in your recommendations today?
I think it's fairly straightforward, Councillor. It just simply doesn't meet the definition that was laid out by the province in terms of the legislation. So it's very clear that we can only include properties that fall within the residential tax rate.
Okay, because Vancouver's does include, they call it class 1 residential. It's quite a bit broader, not only multi-unit, but condominiums, nursing homes, farm buildings, daycare facilities, but so it's a difference in the provincial legislation.
That's exactly it, Councillor.
Is it something that staff think would be beneficial? Is this something that City Council should be lobbying the government to expand the availability, or do you see a need for it? It's just we can't do it? But looking for your opinion.
It would require a change in legislation, and it's just hard to say, Councillor, how the province would react to that, whether it would be a positive reaction and how long it would actually take them to do it. So we're working within the framework that we have before us today.
And Mr. Mayor, so just to add actually to Wendy's point there, condominiums are actually included and would be subject to the vacant unit tax. Multi-residential units, so these are units that are actually out, multiple units under one building that are actually for rent purposes, are excluded. And that approach is very similar to what Vancouver has. They also exclude more than 7 units that are for rental purposes, but condominiums are subject to tax, to the vacant unit tax.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying.
Great, thank you. Conseil Fleury, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Wendy and Joseph, for the presentation. Very clear and good delegations. There was a question earlier from Cheryl from the Hintonburg community. It sort of struck me in terms of our ability to monitor, and I thought it was interesting relating to utility cutoffs and specifically utility or energy consumption. I think the reference was Hydro Ottawa, but I think it would apply to our water billing. Can you maybe clarify, could that be used as a baseline tactic to monitor vacancy?
It's a really great question, Councillor, and something that we have to operate within the confines of MFIPA and basically the collection of that data for that intended purpose. So we're really in what I would say a little bit of a box in terms of how we can actually apply that. So we have to adhere to why we're collecting that data, and that data is being collected solely for billing and collection purposes and not for alternate uses. So it's a challenge for us.
Okay, no, I appreciate you clarifying that. So we would need the province to, or what actions would we need if we wanted to get past that boundary of MFIPA, if we wanted to use that as a monitoring tool?
I think that would really come in terms of a change in where owners would agree to sharing of that information, as would anyone else who's in that property.
So it has to be a willing disclosure for this. I'm hearing. Okay.
That's correct.
Okay, and then on the revenue side, so it's quite interesting revenue when you look at it, 26 million over 6 years, or just under that. The mayor, rightly so, made reference to the long-term plan for housing, which I think when I looked at the report, I looked back, it earmarked $1 million annually, maybe from this revenue. Are we today, as part of this report, are we bounding ourselves to where those revenues are going? Can you maybe clarify what decisions, what's in front of us today, and what future decisions we're going to need to make on the assignment of those revenue sources?
Yeah, so what you have before you today, I think it sheds a little bit more light and a little bit more clarity in terms of what that revenue expectation may be. When we penned the report for the long-range financial plan, we hadn't done this work. As you know, we had not done the study. We had not done a detailed analysis of what that revenue could look like. So as we move through this, and I would suggest to you, we're really not going to know until we see what comes in 2023. And at that point, we'll be able to do an evaluation, if not the following year.
Okay, can I just clarify what I'm hearing? So I'm hearing there's our objective goals in a long-term financial plan for housing, but that general revenue, or the revenue of it, needs to be clarified so that we can know where it's spent. Is that kind of a fair summary?
We just need to know. We need to see the actuals come in, Councillor.
It's in the report. That was one of the conditions when I moved the direction that the money stay in housing. So thank you, Councillor, for raising that.
Mr. Mayor, can I clarify? Are we saying that are we assigning a particular amount to that, or that's just an objective?
No, it's the full amount, and we'll know the full amount once we have the final analysis.
Okay.
So, my hope is it comes in as close as the 26 million as possible.
I appreciate you clarifying that. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks. Thank you. So on the two recommendations from staff, carried.
Carried.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Wendy and Joseph and your staff. I know a lot of work went into that, and I appreciate the speed at which you also brought it forward to committee. So we're now back to item number 1, anti-racism secretariat progress update. And our colleague, Councillor King, is with us. And Councillor King will ask you to bring some opening comments. And then I believe some of your colleagues, Suzanne, will do the presentation. And sorry, I apologize. Carol was reminded me, Councillor Dudas has a clarification motion. If you'd like to introduce that, and we'll put it up on the screen. And then go to Councillor King.
Whereas the report entitled Anti-Racism Secretariat Progress Update was distributed on May 20th, 2020, the Finance and Economic Development Committee with the agenda for its meeting of June 1st, 2021. And whereas staff recognize the impact of the city's work on people with disabilities who also experience discrimination and exclusion due to race. And whereas staff consulted with the Accessibility Office to gain a clearer understanding of the intersectional impacts for racialized persons with disabilities. And whereas following agenda distribution and in consultation with the Accessibility Office, staff has expanded the accessibility impact section of this information report to add additional information regarding the experiences of people with disabilities, and a revised version of the report has been provided to members of council on May 31st, 2021. Therefore, be resolved that the Finance and Economic Development Committee receive and consider the revised version of the Anti-Racism Secretariat Progress Report reflecting the expanded accessibility impact section.
Okay, thank you very much. So now over to Councillor King, please.
Thank you and good morning. And firstly, I'd really like to, before we start talking about this specific item, I'd really like to closely align with the sentiments and many comments of the rest of my council colleagues concerning the horrific discovery at Kamloops Indian Residential School. To honor the memory of these children, the flags at City Hall will be flown at half-mast until June 8th for a period of mourning reflective of 1 hour for each child whose life was lost. The loss of 215 children should be unimaginable, but it is part of our national history that must be reckoned with through truth, reconciliation, and most importantly, action. Such tragedy underscores the need to address racism. And that's why I'm pleased as council liaison responsible for anti-racism initiatives that we are seeing real progress being achieved by the Anti-Racism Secretariat on the development of an anti-racism strategy at the city. I'm especially gratified to know that community engagement has been central to the process and will be the key driver in the formulation of policy. Because too many people experience high levels of racism and injustice, it is important that we take continued steps to ensure that the human rights and dignity of all people are protected. That can only be achieved when we individually and collectively take action to disrupt and dismantle the systems and conditions that perpetuate poverty, racism, and oppression in our society. This is a key goal of the Secretariat, and it is important that equity-seeking groups earlier this year, which included the Black, Asian, Muslim, Jewish communities, as well as on an ongoing basis, the Indigenous communities, are the first to be consulted in unique action planning sessions to address the 6 key priority areas that they themselves previously identified, which included employment equity, housing, governance, economic development, health outcomes, and youth development. We also know that internal workshops have also been held with city staff employees. So we've seen great progress take place, And that is because of the hard work of city staff around the newly formed equity directorate that is really undertaking this work. So I want to really thank them for the work that they are undertaking on behalf of us and on behalf of the community. And I look forward to their report on the progress of the anti-racism secretariat to date. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you for your leadership, Councillor King. So I believe now we're going to hear from Suzanne, who's going to bring us through a PowerPoint presentation. So Suzanne, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, committee members, and Councillor King. There are no words or actions that can diminish the pain or the reality of the loss of innocent children. And the painful discovery is when we all collectively grieve together, while also recognizing the distinct trauma this news inflicts on Indigenous employees and Indigenous members in our community. The presentation today will provide a brief update on the work of the Anti-Racism Secretariat, which I may also refer to as the ARS throughout my presentation. I'll offer an overview of the scope and mandate, highlight some of our recent achievements, review the engagement that's taken place to date, including highlights of what we've heard from Ottawa residents, and outline the proposed process for the development of our anti-racism strategy. Next slide, please. So as a brief refresher, the ARS will develop a strategy to target systemic racism in how the city develops policies, makes decisions, evaluates programs, and establishes outcome measures. It will set out to address key areas where Indigenous, Black, and other racialized people face social, political, and economic disparities, specifically within the 6 priority areas previously identified by the community, of which Councillor King has just mentioned. And where the City of Ottawa can make an impact, it will implement concrete actions to narrow these disparities. Next slide, please. The Ontario Human Rights Commission defines systemic racism as patterns of behavior, policies, or practices that are part of the structures of an organization which create or perpetuate disadvantage for racialized persons. As such, the approach of the Anti-Racism Secretariat is first, grounded in examining and bringing about concrete change in these structures at the city. Because it's impossible to disentangle racism from other forms of discrimination, the approach will take an intersectional lens. Intersectionality emphasizes the multiple experiences and identities in which we live. Whether we are women, living with a disability, gender diverse, youth, and so on, there are a multitude of experiences within these identities that need to be examined and considered. Our approach will also work on initiatives to counter the surge of interpersonal acts of racial hate seen in Ottawa. In recent years, we are seeing worrying levels of anti-Semitic and Islamophobic hate crimes, and since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, hate crimes against Asian Canadian communities have surfaced to record levels. I just see that the slide advanced prematurely, but that's fine, we can stay here. The scope of the Anti-Racism Secretariat includes community engagement, education, building capacity, raising awareness, and the development of an anti-racism strategy. Since its creation, the ARS has led and supported multiple sessions which help to socialize the discourse of racism, discrimination, and equity, and also elevate the realities of racialized residents in Ottawa. Some examples of the achievements to date include anti-racism education and awareness activities, like the United for All Anti-Racism Listening Forum, city staff sessions on the mental health impacts of racism, and a public awareness social media campaign focused on combating anti-Asian racism. We've been involved in collaborative anti-racism initiatives within the city and in the broader community. These include advising multiple city departments on anti-racism policy considerations, creating youth programming in collaboration with city and community partners, like the Youth Neighborhood Ambassadors from the Boys and Girls Club to discuss the impacts of racism and how to enhance well-being, and collaborations with Ottawa Public Health, creating videos on Have That Talk meant to empower discussions on racism. These activities and more, as listed in the report, have reached hundreds of Ottawa residents and city staff. Earlier this year, the ARS joined the city's COVID-19 vaccine community engagement task force to ensure an anti-racist and intersectional lens is applied during the planning and implementation of the vaccine rollout. Work to date as it relates to the strategy development includes a comprehensive environmental scan, studying the anti-racism initiatives of other municipalities. A steering group of community partners were called to help guide the development of an expert advisory table who will inform the planning of the strategy. And we completed phase 1 of the action planning sessions. Next slide, please. The strategy is being developed through a multi-phase engagement plan whereby Ottawa residents and staff are asked to identify concrete actions to challenge systemic racism within the 6 key priority areas under the city's jurisdiction. As the strategy aims to confront racism experienced by multiple Indigenous and racialized communities, a variety of resident action planning sessions were hosted by the city to capture a diversity of lived experiences and perspectives. These engagements took place through our Engage Ottawa online survey, through virtual engagement sessions with city staff and management, through virtual resident action planning sessions, and through community partner and stakeholder action planning sessions. Phase 1 of the engagement plan occurred between January and March of 2021, and we were able to engage with almost 580 participants. I would like to highlight, with respect to Indigenous communities, some early engagement began through an Indigenous consulting firm. However, we will be working very closely with our Indigenous partners to further define an engagement framework and to further define an engagement approach and subsequent framework, ensuring it remains Indigenous-led, culturally responsive, and designed to adequately engage with the diversity of Indigenous communities in Ottawa. Next slide, please. So a few highlights on the recommended actions and the key priority areas that we've heard to date. With respect to employment, Ottawa residents would like to see increased hiring, promotion, and retention of racialized staff within the city, which includes establishing benchmarks and targets to track employment progress. In governance, racialized residents would like the city to improve the representation of racialized members at decision-making tables and advisory committees, and that the city promote governance opportunities directly to diverse communities in order to attract candidates from diverse backgrounds. Access to affordable housing remains among the highest priority, including access to information regarding housing supports, services, and tenants' legal rights. With economic development, residents would like to see targeted business development and mentorship programs. Additionally, residents would like to see intentional efforts to highlight the businesses and economic contributions of racialized community members in Ottawa's small business community, in city tourism materials, and in other promotional efforts. In terms of health outcomes, increasing the availability of culturally responsive mental health services. And as it relates to youth development, increasing access to resources for youth in their own communities, professional networking and mentorship opportunities, and the implementation of a diverse youth advisory table to review grant proposals and consider city programs and policies from a youth perspective. A What We Heard report compiling the feedback and recommendations from the action planning sessions will be released later in the fall. Next slide, please. So this slide depicts at a high level our proposed strategy development process. The ARS will begin phase 2 of our engagement at the end of this month, with hopes to reach some of the groups like the youth or racialized individuals living with disabilities who did not engage as actively during the first phase. This engagement will also include meeting with community partners, City of Ottawa leadership, and City Council. Recruitment for an advisory table will also begin this month, and this table will be made up of anti-racism leaders from racialized communities who will inform the planning process and development of the anti-racism framework. These leaders will provide subject matter expertise on the key action items measurements, and expected outcomes of the strategy. Upon release of the What We Heard report, we will host our last phase of engagement for residents, staff, city leadership, and stakeholders. The goal of phase 3 will be to finalize and solidify the actions that will be proposed in the anti-racism strategy. And following phase 3 engagement, the advisory table will work to develop the strategy, of which city staff will then implement, monitor, and evaluate. Next slide, please. So in terms of our proposed timelines and deliverables, in October of 2021, the What We Heard report will be released. The anti-racism advisory table with confirmed membership will be officially announced, and the framework for the strategy, which will include the vision, guiding principles, and strategic priorities, will be presented to committee and council. The anti-racism strategy is then projected to be presented to council in Q2 of 2022. Next slide, please. So I'll end by saying the City of Ottawa is embarking on a historic endeavor to establish its first anti-racism strategy, an effort that is complex and nuanced as the occurrence of racism is so deeply entrenched, often invisible, or has become functionally normalized within our systems and structures. This past year, we've seen increased calls for racial and social justice across the globe. The call for change sought from Ottawa residents will require significant efforts to disrupt the current practices that perpetuate disadvantage within Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities. To quote one of our Indigenous staff, "There is an ocean of trauma in our nation's colonial history. The remains of the 215 children found at the BC Residential School is another painful reminder of how anti-Indigenous racism is deeply seated in this country, and that Indigenous peoples are confronted with sustained colonial violence through a combination of systems that must be dismantled using a decolonized, self-determined, and Indigenous-led approach." Among racialized communities, the learnings from COVID have further exposed social inequities. The uprising of the Black Lives Matter movement have called for social and moral accountability, and the rise in anti-Asian and Islamophobic hate crimes have further intensified the racial discourse, all of which have amplified the need for a municipal anti-racism strategy. This work as part of the gender and equity, inclusion, Indigenous relations, and social development reinforces our response and brings us closer to challenging systemic barriers and achieving a more just and equitable city. I'm pleased to be able to work alongside you, Council, alongside Council Liaison, Councillor Rawson King. And this brings me to the end of the presentation. I'm now happy to take any questions. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Well, thank you, Suzanne. That was an excellent report, very thorough, and a lot of work has been accomplished with the challenges of COVID as well and not being able to have as many face-to-face meetings. So congratulations. Councillor King.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I would also like to thank Suzanne and staff for all the work that they've been undertaking on this initiative. It's just incredible, especially when we consider a lot of the challenges that confront us with the state of emergency. I just had a few questions. Based on the community interactions this winter, can you please inform us how many unique individuals participated in the action planning sessions earlier this year?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So we had close to 390 individuals participate in our action planning sessions that were held for Ottawa residents, city staff, and community partners, in addition to the 188 survey responses that we received, for a total of close to 580 participants involved in our phase 1 of engagement.
And in terms of that engagement, did you identify any specific gaps?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, we are certain there were gaps, given the engagement solely took place virtually and during the pandemic. So following phase 1 of the engagement, we were able to evaluate our process, which will inform the next phase of engagement. And we do aim to engage more actively with youth and racialized people living with disabilities, as we did not see them engage as actively during the first phase. And we will be working with community partners and targeting engagement sessions to ensure as many voices can be heard.
Thank you for that. I was also wondering, and I've been very impressed with the fact that we've undertaken a number of internal workshops for city employees. And I was just wondering, what has the response been like to those workshops? And do we have any details concerning the breakdown of where staff who participated came from?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. During the various internal workshops and sessions, such as the impacts of racism on mental health or the data for equity workshops, there was a great presentation from staff with over 400 participants between the two events, and positive feedback was received. We did gather information during our registration process on the departments in which the staff work. And we will be compiling this information in our What We Heard report, which will be released after the second phase of engagement.
Thank you for that. And I know that we referenced the fact that there was difficulties encountered, especially by the racialized and Black communities due to the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on those communities. I was just wondering, how has the pandemic in specific terms affected the work of the Secretariat and the overall engagement strategy?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You're absolutely right. Racialized communities have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And this has directly, in fact, affected the engagement process as many community leaders and residents heal, mourn, or do COVID-related community work. The engagement sessions were all held virtually, and many community members have expressed Zoom fatigue. We're already stretched thin with personal and family commitments. And as a result, the ARS team has had to delay aspects of community engagement due to low participation, which has subsequently delayed some of the progression of the strategy development. But more planning sessions will be scheduled to ensure the community has an opportunity to share their feedback. And what the Anti-Racism Secretariat has had to do is pivot its resources to support the COVID-19 Community Engagement Task Force.
Well, thank you for that. I also want to note the good work that you've been doing with Ottawa Public Health in engaging communities, especially the African, Caribbean, and Black community. I saw that wonderful town hall that was driven by Black doctors talking to the community. And in fact, I found it to be one of the most informative town halls throughout this entire crisis. So I was just wondering, how has that broader pandemic work affected the Secretariat, especially around health and COVID issues, especially earlier this year?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And the work from our colleagues at Ottawa Public Health in relation to their pandemic and vaccine response across the city has been tremendous. As I had shared, the ARS joined the city's COVID-19 vaccine community engagement task force to ensure an anti-racist and intersectional lens is applied in the education and vaccine rollout. And so the team has been involved in identifying and removing barriers that may prevent members in the community from becoming vaccinated. This may include addressing questions or concerns around COVID-19 and availability of the different types of vaccines, and making linkages to multilingual resources, participation in ethnocultural networks, and engaging in community dialogue to really understand, how best can we increase vaccine confidence and increase access to vaccine in racialized communities. So this has led to culturally focused interventions, using resources and outreach methods best able to reach and connect with a variety of ethnocultural groups. And the Secretariat has remained visible in community initiatives during the pandemic. And I think these activities have increased community visibility of the Secretariat and helped to gain further insight into many of the realities of racialized communities.
Well, finally, I really want to thank you and your team for all this work during these difficult times. I'm heartened to know that many other groups, and I've participated with church groups to community associations, want to additionally add to the conversation and contribute to the cause, and will eventually have an opportunity to do so in the next round of consultations. And also based upon the intersectional approach, I'm very pleased that Councillor Dudas has introduced a motion to ensure that accessibility impacts are also addressed to assist people with disabilities who also experience discrimination and exclusion due to race. I continue to look forward to further progress on community consultation, and also look forward to the ultimate finalization of the strategy. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Great. Thank you very much, Councillor King. And we have a question from Councillor Kavanaugh, please.
Here. And thanks so much, Suzanne. I can't believe you were only hired in February, and how much work has taken place since then in just a few short months. This was obviously very, very much needed, and it's been a monumental task. And I can't thank you enough for your leadership in this outcome that we're looking for. The first job, of course, is gathering information, finding out where we stand first. And I just want to talk about the fact that intersectionality is a big part of it. And as the liaison on women and gender equity, I just want to talk about that and how that works into the strategy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Absolutely, we cannot disentangle the different multiple identities in which we live every single day. The Anti-Racism Secretariat works hand in hand with our women and gender specialists. Some examples of that have been around the workshops that we've provided around data equity, and many of the strategic actions that have been identified within the Women and Gender Equity Plan impact racialized women and gender diverse persons. We will continue to be working hand in hand as we develop and progress with the strategy, the anti-racism strategy, recognizing this needs to be anchored within an intersectional approach.
I appreciate that very much. I met with a group in my ward who a group of women, Black Francophones, originally from Africa, who asked me very blunt questions about, our leadership, and do we have any Black women in leadership? And luckily, I could talk about you, Suzanne, but we need to show more in leadership. We need more leadership and in terms of diversity and gender equity. And I appreciate that we're starting that direction. So thank you, because we need to work towards more hiring. My question is, in terms of the Indigenous community, this is a separate function because this is nation to nation. How are we handling that?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So there are ongoing collaborations with the city's Indigenous partners, which will occur to define a broad Indigenous engagement approach and accompanying framework to address anti-Indigenous racism. We have critical commitments through reconciliation to address the ongoing legacies of colonialism in our systems and structures. So the role for municipalities is in dismantling colonial oppression is first through the acknowledgement that the municipality is founded on colonialism, and subsequently reviewing policies that are oppressive to Indigenous peoples. And we can identify opportunities to improve the city's policies and practices through reconciliation. So the city's role is, I believe, to ensure Indigenous voices, perspectives, and teachings are included in policy and planning, in decision-making, in governance, and ongoing commitments to nurturing the relationships that we have with host nations and urban Indigenous communities.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. And of course, this week, it's been very sobering to hear of the news of the mass grave of children, 215 children who perished within a lifetime of many people who are around right now. So this is not the so distant past, and we have much work to do working with our community. And I appreciate the fact, Mr. Mayor, that you put the flags at half-mast to recognize this horrific news, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Suzanne. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Kavanaugh. So on Councillor Dudas's motion, carried. And on the report, carried and received.
Carried and received.
Carried and received.
Thank you. Our final item on the agenda that was held by Councillor Leeper, I believe was capital budget adjustments, Councillor.
It was all the sexy stuff. Where is it? So my question, Mayor, thank you for holding this, relates to, I'm sorry, I've lost my notes in there. That was a great discussion. Thanks to Suzanne for the work that she's been doing. It relates to the council approval for adjustments to the budget. On page 2 of 3, it is proposed that $400,000 from pavement degradation fees be put into the resurfacing budget. That caught my eye. We did a bunch of work in the past couple of years on road cut fees, and I'm just wondering, is this the revenue that has derived from road cut fees?
Mr. Mayor, if I may answer that question. Yes, as the councillor indicated, we are halfway through a review of what we call the road activity bylaw and the processes for managing road cuts and getting compensated when people cut into the road to install utilities. This is the first year we've actually had money to put back into the system as a result of our new fee structure. We have more work to do on the road activity bylaw to look at the warranty system and the quality of the repairs to roads, and Mr. Curry's team will be doing that work over the next year. But yes, this is the first year we've actually had money to put back into the system with progress.
Okay. Is that amount 400,000? Is that within our budget expectations?
As I said, in the first year of implementing it, we didn't really have a really good prediction on exactly how much we would raise. It has a lot to do with how much construction activity is actually going on in any given year. We're learning as we go. I think the fact that we have 400,000 to put back into road resurfacing is higher than we expected. So it's good. Whether or not we're still collecting enough is part of the road activity bylaw review. And Mr. Curry's team, as I said, is still going to be finishing that. And they're going to be bringing a report to Transportation Committee, I believe, later in the fall.
Okay. No, I'm looking forward to that because it is, I believe it is a larger sum of money than I was expecting to see in there after just a bit of operation. I guess one of the questions I have is a lot of those road cut permit fees would have been collected from specific geographies where there is a significant amount of infill. And the money is being proposed to go into the resurfacing budget, which obviously, it's a priority of the mayor's, and all of us spoke a lot about that during the election as well. What is the opportunity to ensure that there is a geographic nexus between the point at which the funds are collected versus how they're allocated? Because when they go into the resurfacing budget, I'm not guaranteed that, cut after cut on Northwestern Avenue is going into resurfacing Northwestern Avenue. So I don't know what that looks like moving forward.
So, Mr. Mayor, I'll try to be succinct in this response, but it is a conversation worthy of more discussion, and it will come up in our report at the Transportation Committee. So first of all, $400,000 looks like a lot of money, but when it comes to laying asphalt, it's not a lot. So this year, the simplest answer was to throw it into the resurfacing budget. But as we come forward with the full-blown strategy, we are going to look at whether or not some of it should go into the select maintenance budget as opposed to the resurfacing budget that targeted geographically better. But we still have citywide priorities. We have an asset management system that prioritizes the roads that are in the worst condition. And we do bring those reports in the budget every year to you as what are the priorities for resurfacing. And that's based on traffic volume, cost, affordability, other construction projects that are going on that may affect ripping up the road again. That's part of the logic every year. But as I said, we are looking at whether some of it could be targeted to the maintenance budget to look at it. I mean, if the road repair system works properly when we get compensated and we have better designed road patches, you wouldn't necessarily have to rip up and resurface a road at the end of a construction project. It should be done properly, and these are under warranty. But Northwestern Avenue is an example where the road turns into a Swiss cheese, and that's the situation where we have to look at the system, and we'll bring proposals forward for those sorts of situations. But for most of the roads, it's only 1 or 2 cuts, and the normal patch should be fine. But we understand the point the councillor's making, and we're happy to have further discussion as we finalize that report.
Okay, I take no issue with putting that 400K into the resurfacing's budget, and I absolutely do understand this is like what a third of a very small shave and pave or somewhere in that ballpark. So it's not a huge sum of money, but I was fascinated to see it in the budget, I think, for the first time, and I look forward to those discussions about how that might evolve moving forward. Thank you very much. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Just to follow up, you brought up a good point, Councillor Leeper, is the quality of the reinstatement. I know, for instance, on my own street, there's 3 or 4 cuts as a result of infill and so on. And often it ends up creating almost a speed bump sometimes, or a depression because it's not properly done. And then that, of course, creates leaks, which then creates thaw freeze cycles. So I don't know if it's Mr. Curry or Mr. Willis. What do we do to actually ensure that it's done properly and go back, a few weeks later to make sure it's properly done? And if it isn't done, do we have the ability to tell them to do it over again? Because that's one of the frustrations. You want to reinstate it to the same smooth surface. And I think of when I'm cycling around, if it's not properly done and it goes all the way to the edge of the street, it creates this unnatural and sometimes unsafe bump in the road.
So, Mr. Mayor, I'll take a shot at answering, and Mr. Curry may wish to add. So first and foremost, we were revamping the entire system. And we started last year in phase 1, and Mr. Curry is bringing a phase 2 report. We're looking at the fees we charge when people cut into the road to help pay for the maintenance effects of cutting into the road. We're looking at the warranty system so that when people do patches, that they're required to come back and fix them if they aren't done properly. We had changed and revamped our inspection system entirely last year. This is the first year of the new inspection system, where we have the same people who do infill inspection doing the inspection of those road cuts and working collaboratively together. They're part of the same team now. So we've done a lot of advancements, but there's more work to do. And the other thing we're going to be looking at is actually the shape of the cuts and the reinstatement, because that has a lot to do with the how well they hold, how they affect cycling. For example, those are things that we are looking at of the report.
Thank you. So Councillor Hughley, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to ask Mr. Willis, with this road cut, does this include like when we have the utilities that cut into a sidewalk? Because I've got 2 cases out here recently where they're cutting into concrete sidewalks and filling it with asphalt, and it looks just terrible.
So I'll ask Mr. Curry to jump in if he's available to perhaps answer that specific question.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, Councillor, certainly this does apply to sidewalks as well as the roadbed. What you're probably seeing there is a temporary asphalt patch. I'm not aware, and I'm happy to follow up offline with you about the particulars, whether it was done in the winter time or even the early spring. We often see that go down. But as Mr. Willis said, once the actual work is done, we have a first inspection go out to ensure that it's reinstated to the city's satisfaction. And then there is 2 more inspections over the next 2 years to ensure the quality of the cut. And that's all been in place since 2019. But certainly happy to work with your office on reviewing those specifics because it's the intention that concrete is replaced with concrete.
Okay, thank you. That for citywide response, that would be important, and for everybody to know that if they see asphalt, it's supposed to only be temporary. Okay, thank you. I look forward to hearing from the court. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thanks, Councillor Hughley. So on the item is presented, carried.
Carried.
Update. Motions, notice of motions for consideration of subsequent meeting. Any written inquiries, Madam Clerk?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Other business? See none. Adjournment. Motion to adjourn. Carried. Adopté. Our next meeting will be Tuesday, July 6th. La prochaine réunion sera le 6 juillet 2021. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all very much.